professor of sociology here at Minnesota. He's the incoming editor of Law and Society Review. He's got a background in sociology of law, and his current research interests are in the effect of legal interventions on collective representation and memory in mass atrocities. His presentation today draws on his NSF-funded research on the case of Darfur.
What I'm interested in this research is the question how media in 8 Western countries represent the violence in Africa for the case of Darfur. I'm particularly interested in the context of this conference in the tension between a globalizing narrative, a relative uniformity across countries in the representation, and on the other hand, national particularities, cultural sensitivities in different countries that contribute to country-specific representation. When I say representation, I mean 3 things. Number 1, I mean acknowledgement. To what degree is the suffering and the victimization accounted for in the news media? Secondly, I mean the framing. The question here is how is the violence described? Is it described as a civil war, as an insurgency and counter-insurgency, as a complex humanitarian emergency, or is it described as criminal violence, in which maybe the state is presented as a criminal perpetrator? These are different framing strategies. Thirdly, I'm interested in the use of bridging metaphors. What do the media do in terms of linking this current day violence to past episodes of violence and genocide? And here I will pick a couple of examples of referencing the Holocaust. The data we use, should have moved on, the data we use are based on a content analysis we conducted of 3,400 media reports from 8 countries. These are articles and opinion pieces. We selected a conservative and a liberal newspaper in each of these countries. This is supplemented by 50 in-depth interviews I conducted with Africa correspondents, with foreign policy makers in the foreign ministries of the countries involved, and with NGO workers, specifically from Amnesty and from Doctors Without Borders, so one more rights-oriented and one more humanitarian aid-oriented NGO. Wahutu, by the way, has recently conducted interviews with 10 or 12 Africa correspondents from Kenya and South Africa, and this is work that we'll be presenting at the American Sociological Association this coming summer. I will proceed in 3 steps. I first want to talk about homogeneity and some conditions of homogeneity in reporting. Then I want to talk about and give you 3 specific cases, 3 countries in which the reporting took somewhat different shape, and think about the conditions why this might be the case. And then in the end, I have one slide from our multivariate analyses, and I want to go into this. Homogeneity. I will just show you one graph for an illustration. In this bar graph, each bar represents one country. Here are the 8 countries: US, Canada, UK, Ireland, France, Germany, Austria, and Switzerland. And here are the numbers of displaced people given by the news media in these 8 different countries. We don't have a very nice statistical indicators, so you will have to rely on the visual impression. But I think what you will see is that the estimates of displacements of population in Darfur do not vary in any massive way between the reports in the United States, for example, or in Switzerland, or in Germany, for that matter. There's relative homogeneity. I could show you more slices of victimization and suffering, like the estimated death toll, for example, and we would find a similar notion of relative homogeneity in reporting. And so we're interested, number 1, in what might contribute to such relative homogeneity. We identified through our interviews first micro and then macro sociological conditions. Micro sociological conditions, something that we refer to as local cosmopolitan media networks. And what do we mean by that? I want to give you a quotation from an interview with an Africa correspondent that illustrates what we have in mind. In Nairobi, things are rather informal, he says. There is not a sense of competition, so you sit down with colleagues to learn from others who have just been to an area, what things look like out there. There's quite a lively exchange of experiences and information, and that certainly also leads to some kind of opinion formation. Often that is not possible in Africa in any other way. As a single person, one cannot charter a plane. The trip on a chartered plane to Northeast Congo included journalists from the US, UK, Switzerland, and Germany. There was this later in the interview, there was this foreign correspondence club. There I met Canadian colleagues, Zimbabwean colleagues, etc. So we see that at a time where news media typically can afford only one single correspondent on the entire African continent, where these correspondents are sited in limited places like Nairobi or Johannesburg, they form intense social networks in which communication flows, and this communication flows contributes to a relative degree of homogeneity in news reporting about African events. Secondly, we identified global or macro-sociological conditions. Almost all the interviews that are conducted, the Africa correspondents referred to important sources of information on which they relied. Those were reports by international non-governmental organizations and international organizations such as Amnesty, Human Rights Watch, Doctors Without Borders, and of course United Nations reports. In addition, all journalists said that they relied on powerful news media who have many more journalists on the ground than their own, in all cases, very prominent newspapers. And the ones cited most frequently were BBC, CNN, and the New York Times. In addition to these sources of information, we were interested what the effect is of interventions by international organizations, and our particular interest was by judicial institutions. In this case, of course, the International Criminal Court on the reporting of the atrocities, and especially the framing of the atrocities committed in Darfur. We have relatively little previous empirical systematic research on the impact that international judicial intervention has on the depiction of atrocities, and so this is one step in this direction. A number of scholars, several of whom are in this room, like Marcos Hill, Devin Anders, John Hagen, have taken steps in this direction for domestic courts, but also for the ICTY in John Hagen's case. The hope, of course, is that many political and judicial actors have expressed, and President Roosevelt and Justice Jackson in the years preceding the Nuremberg Tribunal, of course, hoped that the tribunal would document with witnesses under oath and all the written documents an historic account of the atrocities committed in the context of World War II, so that the world would never doubt the incredible things that were committed in the context of the war. So how does this unfold in the case of Darfur? I will just show you one simple graph. What you have here is the percentage of articles in different time periods that refer to the violence in Darfur as criminal violence. Each line represents the newspapers of one of our 8 countries. These are all intervention points. What you see is that there are several peaks, several time periods in which the news media are most likely to speak about the violence as criminal violence. And the first peak occurs in 2005 when the Commission of Inquiry files its or publishes its report that it wrote for the UN Security Council about the violence in Darfur. The second peak occurs at the point where the prosecutor of the ICC applies for an arrest warrant against two mid and low-level, Mr. Harun and Mr. Kushai, individuals involved in this violence. And then the final two peaks at the very end of the timeline are the moments where the prosecutor files for an arrest warrant for Mr. al-Bashir, and where this arrest warrant is indeed issued. In Darfur, I want to pick three cases in order to illustrate and think a little bit about the conditions under which the crime frame is more or less likely to be used. The first case is that of the United States, where 54% of the articles and 76% of the editorials use the crime frame when they write about Darfur. The diagnosis of genocide we identified in 31% of American media reports and in 62 of American opinion pieces. The United States thereby shows a pattern that is more inclined to use a crime and genocide frame than other countries. If we look at the use of bridging metaphors, this impression becomes more intense, if you want. I picked for illustration here two quotations from op-ed pieces by Niklas Christoph, in which he builds bridges between the Holocaust and the violence in Darfur in a rather manifest way, if you want. The first one is called Sudan's Final Solution. The Sudanese authorities, much like the Turks in 1915, the Nazis in the 1930s, apparently calculated that genocide offered considerable domestic benefits, like the long-term stability to be achieved by a final solution of conflicts between Arabs and non-Arabs, and that the world would not really care very much. It looks as if the Sudanese bet correctly. Jeffrey Alexander talks about the American tendency to privilege a progressive narrative in which we can clearly distinguish between evil and good, and in which the United States typically fights on the side of the good that will prevail over evil. These are some conditions which I think contribute to America's inclination to depict the conflict in Darfur in relatively stark terms, in terms of criminal violence, in terms of genocide, and in terms of a linkage between the Holocaust and other previous atrocities and what occurred in Darfur. I'm going to move to a second country that differs in the depiction of the violence of Darfur from the American case, and this is Germany, and I entitled this German Ambivalence. What we find in the German case is that the crime frame is also used more frequently than in most other countries. In 49% of articles, 65% of the opinion pieces we analyzed. However, the genocide frame is used much more cautiously, not even half as frequently as in the American media, with 17% of articles and 24% of opinion pieces. In Germany, we also find many fewer attempts at bridging, drawing links between the Holocaust and the violence in Darfur, and sometimes, in fact, those links are what we call bridging challenges, meaning challenges to the notion that there is similarity. Here I have a quotation for illustration from the Süddeutsche Zeitung from Munich, in which Alex Rühle reviews two books, including one by Robert Stockhammer, and Rühle quotes Stockhammer, who himself quotes historians. It goes as follows: compared to the German death camps during the Holocaust, the daily killing rate in Rwanda was 5 times higher. Another quote: at that rate, Hitler would have completed the Holocaust in less than 9 months, not 6 years. This was in the English original. And then he continues: the central paradox of such sentences, all from serious historical studies, Stockhammer argues, is that here something is compared with that which is synonymous with the uncomparable. So the uniqueness of the Holocaust is stressed, and the attempt to draw linkages between the Holocaust and Darfur is challenged. The question is, why does Germany differ in this respect? And I don't have a perfect explanation, but in my interviews, I was alerted to certain cultural sensitivities. Initially, I was surprised. This was counterintuitive to me. I thought that Germany, with its history, would be more inclined than other countries to alert the world to genocides if they unfolded today, that there was a specific moral responsibility. So I was surprised. Let me give you, out of the interviews I conducted, 2 illustrations, responses to my questions when I expressed this surprise. One was with an Africa correspondent of a German newspaper who said, if the fact that I, as a German, report about Darfur has any effect on my writing, it's the following. When I use the concept of genocide, I subsume the Holocaust under the genocide. Once I've subsumed the Holocaust under the concept of genocide, I have a very hard time placing Darfur under the same label. I cannot put these 2 events into the same category, no matter how horrendous the violence was that unfolded in Darfur. In another interview I conducted with a rabbi who is the director of a major Holocaust memorial, who is also the son of an Auschwitz survivor. I challenged him and I said, I'm astonished when I visit German Holocaust memorial sites. I see commemoration, but I don't see what I see at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in the United States, in Washington, where there's a dual mission. There's commemoration and there's alerting the world public to contemporary atrocities. Why do I not see this in Germany? I would think that the moral responsibility is particularly high in this country. His answer was, the Americans can do this. As Germans, we cannot do this. As soon as we draw a linkage between the Holocaust and the genocide and the violence in Darfur or other such places, we would be accused of relativizing the Holocaust, of minimizing the uniqueness of what occurred under the Nazi regime. This was not just any German, this was a rabbi, the son of an Auschwitz survivor, who guards himself against this sort of reproach. And I found that remarkable. This does point at certain cultural sensitivities that we find in the German context that might at least help us explain the more cautious use of references to the Holocaust and of the genocide label than we find in America. The third case I wanted to pick out is the Irish case, which I entitled Irish Reluctancies. In Ireland, in our news media analysis indicated that the crime frame is used less frequently than in other countries, and that the genocide diagnosis is used as cautiously as it is used in Germany. And again, it is our interviews that give us some indication as to why this Irish reluctance might be explained, what cultural and policy preferences might be responsible for it. And I will give you some quotations from interviews I conducted in the Foreign Ministry in Dublin, where one respondent said, we always point to the history of our aid program, that it has very strong roots. Also in Sudan, a lot of our focus was humanitarian. There are still about 2,000 missionaries whom we fund for the development work, and there would also be NGOs whose roots would be in the Catholic missions. Then in another place in the interviews, Irish policy is aligned, but it is also with a particular focus. We have no axe to grind. We got a little bit more weight in Sudan when we say we come particularly for the delivery of humanitarian aid. And later, in this interview and in other interviews, respondents refer to the Irish collective memory, the national memory of the potato famine, and of the extreme experience of extreme poverty that motivates this strong focus on humanitarian and developmental aid delivery. The interviews continued. I will give you one more quotation from the Irish interviews. Ours is an impact lens rather than a causality lens. It has always troubled me with regards to the likes of the ICC and how one attributes responsibility. It wasn't a clear-cut situation because nothing in Sudan is. Since ICC intervention, certainly the situation on the ground has deteriorated. Sudan would certainly not be alone if the impunity road was taken. You could not even call it impunity. There are different options, and it points to truth commissions and amnesties as alternatives. I found very similar types of arguments in the interviews I conducted with Sudan and Darfur specialists at Doctors Without Borders, MSF. Very similar arguments. The dependency on collaboration with the Sudanese government to deliver humanitarian aid, and this dependency on collaboration produces a reluctance to engage in criminalizing narratives and to using the term genocide. This is not foolproof proof, but it gives us maybe some indication as to the cultural sensitivities and policy practices that dominate in different countries and that contribute to different kinds of framing of contemporary atrocities like those in Darfur. Now we might challenge this and say these are just 3 individual countries, and so we went one step further, and I apologize to those who are less statistically inclined. We conducted logistic regression analysis, some of which is captured in the simplified table, in which we included only relationships that did.
This is it.
Then, thank you very much. In which we depict only relationships that are statistically significant. This is too big a table to go through all of it, but I want to show you, maybe direct your attention to this line, which this is hierarchical, means we simultaneously include country level variables and article level variables. And this first line under level 2 depicts the relationship between the percentage of humanitarian aid to a country's gross national product and the impact of that on different ways of depicting the violence in Darfur. And what we see is that there is a negative impact. The higher the humanitarian aid of a country is in relation to gross national product, the lower the reporting about killings, the lower the use of the crime frame, of the humanitarian crime frame, of the lower the usage of the label genocide, the lower the likelihood that there will be the use of a crime prognostic, meaning supporting a criminal justice resolution of the conflict, and the lower the likelihood that the state will be depicted as a criminal state. The only plus we see here is a greater likelihood, speaking about the number of displaced people. That's totally consistent with the humanitarian aid mission, because that goes to displaced people in the refugee camps. The social movement had already taken off, but the UN had not yet intervened, and certainly the ICC was not yet active. What we do find, and these are the next columns, is that the crime diagnostic, the use of the term human rights crimes and of the concept of genocide and support for a criminal justice solution of the conflict increases statistically significantly in the period following the application for an arrest warrant against Mr. al-Bashir. So we learned something about the impact of judicial intervention on the framing of violence in this particular African case. I have and I have just one remaining slide, so we have a little more time for discussion, which I summarize a few concluding comments. And this, of course, tries to tell us what we learn. And let me look at it from here. What we learn, number one, is that media do indeed report contemporary mass violence. This may be a comfort to those who are concerned with such violence reaching the attention of a global audience. We find that the acknowledgements of violence, the estimates of death tolls, the estimates of displacements are relatively uniform. There's actually one interesting exception for which I have absolutely no explanation, and that's that the percentage of articles reporting rape is exactly twice as high in the English-speaking news media than in the French and German-speaking news media. Apart from that, very high level of homogeneity in acknowledgements. We do find that media communicate frames that are set by global actors, and that international criminal justice intervention has a significant effect on the way in which the violence is framed, that it is framed as criminal violence and that it is framed as genocide. We find that national forces filter global messages, and that this filtering affects particularly the framing of the violence and the use of bridging metaphors, specifically bridging to the Holocaust. Is this a hopeful picture for those who are concerned about fighting and reducing mass violence? Yes, maybe, but certainly we know about the contingencies of international attention and intervention. The international attention was high in the case of Darfur. It is not high in other cases. It was not high in Cambodia. It was not high in Eastern Congo during those conflicts, are considerably less intense than it was in the case of Darfur. And we know there are very specific social movement conditions that contributed to the particular attention that Darfur attracted. A second caution, of course, that is that we are quite uncertain about the consequences, because even though much world attention was directed at Darfur, and even though the UN Security Council picked up the case, and even though the ICC charged, including the president of the country of Sudan, all of this seems to have had relatively little effect on the unfolding of the violence on the ground. So, hope, yes, maybe, no, I'm not sure. But this is my story. It's very condensed. We are only in the very beginning stages of writing about this. We have collected the data. We have begun to analyze the data, and here's a little bit of insight into the work. And Bella, I wish I had seen your book. Which year was it published?
2010.
2010. See, I wrote this proposal in 2008. It got funded in 2009. 2010 we started our data collection. Wish I had known it before. But we work in different disciplines, and there are these disciplinary boundaries that, Alan, this fades compared to what you do. Because this is maybe an important comment. And it also contributes to my uneasiness in speaking about this, because we are so far removed from the violence. Even you as a journalist are one step removed. There is the violence unfolding the way people experience it. Then there is a second step in which journalists report it, mediate this violence to a wider audience. And then somewhere down the road are people like us who analyze the way you write about that violence that happens to others. We are very far removed, and that makes us feel maybe slightly uneasy about doing these analyses. But alas, it's our job, that's what we get paid for, and thank you very much.
Also looked at, you said, a conservative and a liberal paper in each country, but you didn't really talk about political differences in your presentation. I just wondered if you could, very briefly, indicate whether there were significant political differences and what those might have amounted to.
There are significant differences in the liberal conservative spectrum. I would have to look at the data again. We have not written about that yet, but yes, that is the case. And of course, there's an issue with the selection of news media. We try to identify the most prominent newspaper on each side of the political spectrum, mainstream papers in all cases.
But when you're talking about the framing, like the crime frame, and when they use the crime frame and when they don't, are you talking about the way that the sort of in the voice of the reporter or the voice of the paper itself frames it, or their reportage on other people's frames? It's one thing for the article to say genocide is occurring in Darfur. It's another thing for the article to say the ICC prosecutor says genocide is occurring in Darfur.
Regarding the framing, I wish I could say, and that was our initial attempt, that we identified the framing that the reporter wanted to use. That's what we tried initially. But after weeks and months of trying, we saw that the intercoder reliability was so low because it is very difficult. What a reporter does, and Alan can speak to that, and maybe Bella also, is really tie together a series of statements from interviews from different sources that have a certain level of credibility. And in fact, each article may be coded for more than one frame. Then maybe talk about humanitarian emergency and talk about criminal violence, and then we would code this article for both reasons. No, this is, the question is that we coded, is an authoritative source cited, or does the journalist him or herself speak about this as criminal violence? That's a more limited indicator, but that's what we do. Thank you for asking.